All right, everybody. So today we have Lyle McDonald back on the podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm good, Dave. How are you?
So we were just talking about these unusual times we're in, and you have been terribly affected. Some people have been extremely affected. Obviously, there's a huge range there. I'm
Sure.
glad to hear you're doing well. A lot of people are hanging out at home, gaining weight, and I've actually still been continuing to diet throughout this period. I have a
hmm
decent setup for working out. But on a somewhat recent podcast, I was talking about weight loss and that whole whoosh effect, and I
Yeah.
remember maybe a decade ago now, reading your article on long-term delayed fat loss effect.
Yes.
And one of the cool things when you get into the science of probably any endeavor you're doing, you have these inclinations, and then you see, yes, that's it. That's what I've
Right.
known for a while. Because I remember dieting and dieting and dieting, and then lightening up, maybe adding a few hundred calories, and I could pretty accurately say that most of the time I would lose another pound or so, maybe
Yeah.
2 pounds. And I'd look a little bit better. I'm like, this is great. I'm eating more. It was just that effect. And I thought it was fat loss because I'm like, well, and I mean, depending on how low the calories were beforehand, it could have been
Sure.
some fat loss. But
Yes.
I was like, this is great. Like, my metabolism is speeding up a lot and all this stuff. And then reading your article, it was like, yes, this is exactly what I've experienced. So I have some questions related, but can you just briefly explain to people what the long-term delayed fat loss effect is?
Right. So first, I should explain the name, which is a little bit of a joke.
Yeah.
There's an old book called Super Training by Mel Sif and Yuri Verkhoshansky, both of whom have since passed away. And the Russians believed in this idea they called the long-term delayed training effect.
Hmm.
And the idea was that they would just pound on their athletes for a couple months and they would get slower and weaker and worse. And then, sort of after they would taper and start to change focus, they would see everything rebound to a higher level, hence the long term delayed training effect. I thought it would be cute to just call this the long term delayed fat loss effect because big acronyms are cool. And eventually, I'm going to write like an article about the long term delayed muscle growth effect, which is the same thing reversed. And
Right.
and sort of what I was trying to describe is this phenomenon that I would say most of us have experienced, not everyone, where you're dieting and you're training and you're doing everything correctly and accurately. And I make that point because a lot of plateaus and stalls in dieting are really because people are misestimating their food intake. And
Right.
I'm not saying they're cheating, I'm not saying they're lying. We're all very bad at this. And frequently, what we think we're eating is not really how much we are eating. But assuming that you're not doing that, and generally the fitness neurotic, the serious fitness trainee,
Right.
pretty good about that. And you'll just stall for a couple of weeks or 2 or 3 weeks. And like the numbers add up, the math adds up. You should be losing body fat. Something should be happening and nothing. And then something will happen, and it could be a couple different things. Sometimes, like you said, people will do, sort of a structured refeed, as I called them, or they'll bring calories to maintenance, either by design or by accident, right? Some people are just like, you know what, screw this. I've been training hard for 3 weeks for nothing, so this is crap. And they'll take a couple days off and they'll eat more, and then all of a sudden the next day they're like 5 pounds lighter if they're a bigger dude, or a couple pounds lighter, or whatever it is. Now, clearly, you did not burn 7,000 calories of fat in that 2 day span, right? It's
Right.
physiologically impossible. So there must be something else to explain it, and it seems to be mostly water. And there's has anybody studied this? Not directly, although I've come across a couple of interesting papers that kind of observed it indirectly, but it has to be. I mean, it could be food in the gut, I suppose, but by and large, it's probably just water retention. And it doesn't take much water retention to mask fat loss, right? If you're on, a moderate diet and you should be losing a pound of fat a week, all it takes for you to hold a couple pounds of water, and it looks like 2 weeks of dieting have done nothing.
Right.
You've also got the issue that this is very sort of circumstantial, but people who use those bioelectrical impedance scales,
Hmm.
which they're measuring body water, would often note that the day before their weight would drop and they would look better, they would start getting screwy numbers on the BIA. Like, I think it would, however it works, it would show them as basically holding the total body water would be higher, and then the next morning it would be gone.
Mm.
Um, And I had always sort of linked that at least semi-causally to cortisol levels, right? Cortisol is a stress hormone, dieting is a stress, exercise is a stress, being a head case is a stress. And I'm not joking about that, right?
Right.
There's a personality profile that frequently goes along with this. And dieting just is a stressor. One group studying women has called it dieting a psychogenic stress, because you're just like, I got to get lean, I got to get in shape for whatever reason. And cortisol can bind to the receptor that's involved in water retention. It's called the mineralocorticoid receptor. And when there's enough of it, it can cause water retention. And when you take that day off, when you raise your carbs or raise your calories to maintenance, cortisol levels reliably drop. And I think that's part of what's going on. Going back to when I was in college, my exercise physiology professor told us, he said that there was data supposedly that when fat cells empty, right, and fat cells are about 85-90% actual fat molecules, triglyceride, right, and the rest of it is cellular machinery, and there is some water in there, that it would refill up with water. Like, so once you empty out the triglyceride, it would temporarily fill back up with water. And the idea is that glycerol, which is the backbone of triglyceride molecules, can attract water. So they would fill back up with water temporarily, and then eventually that would be lost, presumably. And I looked for like 20 years, like a decade, anything to support this, because frequently stuff just gets repeated that's not true. And frequently it's like, for all I knew, the data was from 1952. Like, nobody knew. And I could never find it. And I've seen one paper that visceral fat can refill back up with water when obese people lose fat. Like, there's not a lot of direct data, but there's something going on.
Visceral fat cells? That one paper showed?
I believe so. I have to go back and look, but it's like you see a change in like the water to fat ratio. And visceral fat, it's a little different than regular fat cells. It's like, so I don't know if I would strongly argue for the fat cell filling up thing. It could just be generalized water retention, but something is obviously going on.
Right.
Regardless of the mechanism. And there's all, like, you get to a point like, do I want to know exactly what's going on? Sure. But at some point it's like, this happens, we know it happens, here's what makes it stop happening. Right. And something could, don't let me forget, there's something I was reading earlier today that I'll come back to on the carb issue. But it happens. Something else that people have occasionally observed is they have a little bit of alcohol, which is a diuretic. That will cause it to occur. And also people that are experienced with that water retention thing, and generally speaking, this is women, because women deal with this month to month to month. Right. Like, I don't know, it's hard to describe. It feels different. You just look puffy. When physique athletes get really lean, tiny differences in water balance can really change your visual appearance. Like, you may be lean, but you just don't look as defined because you're holding water underneath the skin. And like, that happens. And then all of a sudden you wake up and your weight's down 3 pounds, and all of a sudden you're just like, wow. Right. So what I conceptualize it as is that you had lost the fat during those 3 weeks where like the scale wasn't changing. Like, something has to be happening. You're in a deficit. So presumably you were losing that fat, and either the fat cells were filling with water, or you're just holding water generally. And then when it finally drops, you get the long-term delayed fat loss effect, which is a very long way to get to your question. Right. And I pretty much thought it was basically water. I actually was reading something earlier today, a very exciting paper called Metabolic Factors Determining the Susceptibility to Weight Gain. And they talked about this thing, compound release from the liver. It's called FGF21, which is fibroblast growth factor. And there will be a quiz tomorrow. And it is involved in, among other things, metabolic rate regulation. And apparently in humans, if FGF21 goes up, it does increase energy expenditure. And one of the things that causes it to go up is carbohydrate overfeeding. So there you go.
Right. I think it's interesting because, as you know, probably after 15 years, I've dieted down 13, 14 times, and despite knowing the research, despite having done it a lot of times, it still does play some mind games, I mean, I started cut back in February. I was 205, first 10 pounds, not surprisingly, flew off in about 6 weeks. Everything was great. And all of a sudden, and I had moderate refeeds in this time, and all of a sudden I'm just like refeeding, and then I'm going back down. I'm hitting like the same weight, and it's just not going anywhere. I took
Yeah,
refeeds away, and I'm like, what is going on? And again, it was also at a calorie level where you start to question. It's not like I was eating 1,500 where I'm like, of course this is a deficit. It's like, all right, I'm at 2,400. Maybe my body adapted enough. Like you just question it. And I actually
sure.
ended up taking a 2 week diet break. Actually, I took off 2 weeks from the gym, even just a lot of things
Yep.
going on. And not too surprisingly, I ended up going down to about 192, 193. Now, part of me was like, okay, did I lose that weight because decreasing stress and all of that, or just by not lifting, you might have less full
Sure.
glycogen, things like
Yes.
that. So I said, okay, instead of going right back into dieting when I start working out, let me do one more week of 2,400 calories, which was kind of like my
Right.
estimate of maintenance,
Yeah.
and while working out. And it seems to be this is actually the last day of that week, and I'm still about 192 to 193. So
Right.
it seems like, okay, there you go. It showed that fat loss, but still there. I mean, especially because if you're just maintaining or bulking, it's kind of like this is still an enjoyable period. But when you're doing something that sucks and you're not seeing the results, it could
Yes.
be a couple of
Exactly.
days, and you can be like, "What's going on?" And even though, again, it's there's certainly a personality type to it. I mean, I'm definitely a type A, like want to be working towards a goal and accomplishing it type.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's still always interesting to see and always frustrating.
Yeah, I mean it is, and this is just one of those things with because there's sort of this current thing of people just crapping on the scale and this and various things, and like I know physique athletes that have dieted down repeatedly. These are high level athletes. They know about all of this, like you said, and I do too. And it doesn't change the fact that it screws with your head when
Hmm.
you're like, I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Nothing has changed. Like intellectually what's going on, but that doesn't change the emotional response to it.
Right, right.
And I've talked to some people. There's dieting has changed a lot in the modern era, certainly compared to when I wrote a lot of this stuff. And I would say certainly refeeds or at least calorie days at maintenance, if not like hardcore overfeeding,
Mm.
and diet breaks have become much more part of the lexicon. And of course now the research is starting to show up, and it was like, yeah,
Yeah.
I get to be a little smug 15 years, 16 years after the fact. And some people have reported that people that are doing those days of maintenance during their diet weeks are not seeing the big water retention related stalls. Like that seems to just be like heading it off the pass by
Mhm.
preventing, I think, cortisol from going up and up and up and up and causing that sort of chronic effect, whatever's going on. Because actually, so as just a random side note, there is an individual in the industry who I will not going to name, but he once took issue with some criticisms I had of his metabolic damage concepts, and I don't really give it away. And he said something to the effect of, well, the water retention thing is only a theory. Oh, no, 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 no. We've known about this for 5 or 6 decades. There is something, if you go back to that seminal paper, right, the Minnesota semi-starvation study, that is really just like, it'll never get done again. It is the
Right,
seminal paper. It's unfortunate because it would be great to repeat it with modern technology.
right.
I've seen them do a couple short term, like a couple of weeks, but you'll never. And people listening to this, they took normal weight men who were actually, oh God, what's the term when people refuse to go to war? Conscientious objectors. They said you got two options: you can go to jail, or you can be in this study.
Mm.
And I think probably in hindsight they wish they. And what they did is they wanted to mimic what happens in a starvation in like a concentration camp.
Right.
So they put the men on 50% of maintenance calories, right? So they called it was semi-starvation, right? It wasn't total starvation. Concentration camp settings, 50% of normal calories. They were forced to do like 2 hours of exercise a day. Now they didn't resistance train, it wasn't high protein, because of course it wasn't. And basically they measured everything. They measured their rate
Mm.
of fat loss, their weight loss, metabolic rate, all this other stuff. And midway through the study, all of a sudden, and I mean, everything was super controlled. These guys got to eat what they got to eat, and they were like
Right.
licking their plates clean, right? There was no cheating. They were locked down. And at some point in the study, several of the men their weight loss, the predicted curve and the real world curve started to diverge, and they knew they weren't eating more. And they measured metabolic rate, and they noted, and I've got the quote somewhere that I can't find, basically that they were showing severe edema, water retention.
Right.
And this was known for years. There was a starvation associated water retention that occurred. And they didn't link it to cortisol, I think to something else that I now forget. And again, the mechanism per se probably doesn't matter as much as it happens.
Right.
And this happened for a couple, 3 weeks, and then they got right back on the curve they were supposed to. And I found some other study that I could not begin to source. Same thing. They saw this weird stair step, and it was like, yeah, for some period of time, just like folks kind of stalled and water weight or whatever it was, and then they got moving again. And like, so it's a pretty well-established phenomenon, and it is established certainly in response to dieting, training. Like I said, there's that psychological aspect of it, that there's a certain personality type of dieter that I think sees it a little bit more frequently than folks a little bit more relaxed. And of course, what do we all do? Things stall, and we figure, well, got to do it harder.
Right.
Got to diet harder, got to train more. And it's like, if anything, the exact opposite is true. And it's usually when people relax for a couple of days that they will see that big whoosh.
I was talking to a few people recently, a couple other podcasters, and it was interesting because to me, I mean, I've been doing carb cycling or refeeds since like almost day one, really. I mean, I got into it with Body for Life, and while I don't necessarily advocate the full cheat day, method, that really literally from day one, I had refeeds, and it was just always this essential thing to me. And, I've seen through the years as it was carb cycling, and then there was, skip loading, if you remember all that. And do you remember skip it was like intense muscle? It was like basically a refeed of all super high processed carbs, like just cereals and pancakes all day. So it's like, you talk about that in your keto book too. But through that, and then in last few years, these diet breaks have become more popular, right?
Yes.
And I was surprised to talk to Steve Hall, if you know him from Revive Stronger podcast, Abel, Chabai, a couple others, and they were saying how they dieted down to pretty lean levels, and actually, I think even contest lean for Steve with no refeeds. And I was just so surprised because I was like, and they obviously know you, they talk to you. I was just very surprised by that, and I kind of want to just get your take on the importance of refeeds, or how important you believe they are. Not just for the weight of the water loss, but if you think they actually enhance fat loss and muscle retention.
So I've heard that too, and what people do need to realize, right, is people dieted for decades without this, right? It's not ever that they've been necessarily required. Clearly, people got into shape. Contest dieters got there without doing any of this. I think maybe more would have gotten there had they. That's always kind of a cop-out answer. I always felt that based on the physiology that they were beneficial and that they would probably be more optimal. So first, I'm going to look at sort of the general public, where I think is where, because you're dealing with different issues. Right. Like, not that you can separate the two out, but in general, the very lean dieter, it's more physiological issues, right? Generally, they've got the food control locked down. They've got all that, sort of, you're dealing with a lot of the body's fighting back issues. And then it's sort of the other extreme, the general overweight dieter. I'll say it's not psychological issues, it's behavioral issues by and large. You don't see the body fighting back quite as hard. It's more long-term food habits, having to change those, taste buds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if anything, right, and there's not a lot of work on this. They're just now, right? Because even when I wrote in 2004, some of it was kind of a connect the dots thing. It's like, okay, we knew that leptin was regulating all these hormonal things in metabolism. I knew that carbohydrate overfeeding of varying lengths would raise leptin. And there was a little bit of a missing middle piece of, presumably this should help to offset those metabolic rate drops. Right. There wasn't a lot of direct data on it. A couple weird papers. One, they took obese individuals, dieted them for 4 weeks, then started raising calories. And as they raised calories, leptin started to recover, but fat loss continued. Now they were raising calories very gradually, right? It wasn't like they were jumping them back to maintenance. So this isn't exactly the same. However, it was at least like, okay, proof of principle.
Right.
In the last couple of years, there have been several studies looking at this. One of them, and they give these studies all these cute little names. Maybe it was the Matador. I don't remember them anymore. And what it did was it either had folks diet straight with no change, or it had them diet 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, I want to say. So they full diet break every 2 weeks. And what they found was that offset some of the decrease in metabolic rate. They lost fat more efficiently. Of course, they had to diet longer, right? Yeah. It's not like this is a magic free ride. That is the drawback of the diet break. But it does seem to have a benefit there. And this was always one of the things I mentioned when I talked about full diet breaks so long ago. Like, you shouldn't really regain a lot unless you completely go off the rails. Even if you do, you'll be returning to your diet in a better place metabolically, so that you'll lose fat more efficiently, and that seems to be the case in the research. And I think they did another one more recently that did that. The question then becomes, what about the short-term refeeds? And I think there's even less data there. I seem to recall I saw reference to some paper that I think did single-day refeeds, or I think. And it did seem to have a small effect. Like, by that, I think it was like 100 calories a day. And don't swear me, like, I read lots of stuff, and lately my brain isn't keeping it locked down quite as well as it used to because I'm getting older. So I don't remember the details quite like I did, and I'm not trying to misrepresent anything. So it did have a small effect. Now the question then becomes, is that small effect does it outweigh any potential drawbacks? Right. So, and there are other reasons for people to raise carbohydrates. For example, when you're training hard, you tend to run out of, eventually, like to cut calories, you got to cut something. You can't cut protein. You can only cut fat so hard. Carbs have to come down. Eventually, your training starts to suffer because muscle glycogen is depleted. Like, this is another reason to raise calories. Now, bigger men have much less of a problem with this than smaller men, and certainly women. Women are playing with much lower calorie intakes, and they don't end up with a lot of carbs in their diet. Smaller men have the same problem. Like, I look back at even moderate deficit diets that I did. The time you set protein where it needs to be, and even moderate dietary fat, you don't get more than about 1 gram per pound of carbs, and eventually your training can start to suffer. But for a lot of people, well, not for a lot of people, for some people, and this seems to be true in the contest, well, in all dieters, frequently those refeed days or maintenance calorie days cause people to just kind of like psychologically lose the plot with their diet.
Yeah.
I remember I did in a podcast, I want to say last year, and somebody mentioned it was some specific contest dieter, and I do not remember the names. And it was like, what he found through experience was that if he did that day at maintenance, he found it for him very difficult to go back, that psychologically for him, it was better to just maintain that diet momentum.
Yeah.
And that is certainly the case. And I would say, if you go back and look at my 2004 book versus some of what I've said now, because I was younger, I was very excited, like, I've got
right.
This is it. I've got the keys to the kingdom now. And leptin really was very much filled in a big puzzle piece for me. I think I've probably mellowed a little bit and realized that for a lot of people, these things can do as much harm as they do good. I especially think that's true for beginning dieters, right? Telling them, you can eat, you can do, if it fits your macros, you can have a free meal from your first week of your diet when you're dealing with, again, long-term, with very established behavioral patterns. Right. May cause more harm than good. And you're in a situation where there's not a lot of metabolic adaptation. They might be better off dieting straight for 4 to 6 weeks, allow taste buds to change, allow some behavioral habits to get built in before they consider any of this. So I think and that's where I'm finding, as usual, I'm between both zealots, just like I was with my ketogenic diet. It's all about disciplined zealots, where you don't realize that what they can do is not right for everybody. But the flexible dieting zealots have become just as frustrating to me.
Sure. Because
in their mind, if you're not flexible eating, you have an eating disorder, you're orthorexic. Well, no, for a number of reasons. Not the least of which being that flexible dieting was never strategies. It was a mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Flexible eating is a set of attitudes. And I made this point in my book, but I think a lot of people kind of heard it's like, oh, flexible dieting is free meals, refeeds, diet breaks, if it fits your macros. Right. Nope. Those were strategies. Flexible eating attitudes is a way of approaching the fact that food is not good, bad, moral, immoral, getting out of that black and white thinking. Right. Had nothing to do. Those were simply ways of applying it. You can completely be strict about your diet and still adopt flexible eating attitudes. In the sense of, because I ate this little thing, I am not a morally bad person because It is a quote unquote. That's all flexible eating attitudes ever were in the literature. So I think so the people that are like, you must do this or you're dieting wrong, I don't agree with that. People are that you should never do it. There are a couple of luminaries in the field, one of whom has said the reason natural bodybuilders are not as big as the pros is because they use flexible if it fits your macros. Okay.
Who said that?
I'll tell you after we're done.
Okay.
I try to avoid doing too much naming and shaming.
Yeah.
And to which I asked this individual, and because they don't train hard enough.
Yeah.
To which I said, well, if that's true, then why are you on testosterone? Right. Why don't you just train harder and eat strictly? And that he didn't have an answer to that.
Yeah.
But whatever.
Yeah, it's definitely frustrating, I think, talking to anybody like that, where there's always going to be a level where you can just tell, like, it's not going to get through. And that is hard as somebody like for me, right? Like, I don't have any like powerlifting competitions I've won. I'm not a professional bodybuilder or anything like that. So there's always going to be some air of like, I can throw all the logic in the world at you, but you can always just say that like, well, why don't you look like that then? So I don't even, I try not to engage in too many of those conversations. But the refeeding I think is interesting because I know other people who feel like, there's Jeff Alberts from 3DMJ. He talked about how he competes 10 pounds heavier than he did, I don't know, like 10 years ago, but he was already 20 years into lifting at that point. And what I pointed out to a friend was like, well, and eventually Jeff pointed this out too, was that like, no, he didn't gain 10 pounds of muscle, obviously, after 20 years. He dieted better. But, and so one of the big things he mentioned was the incorporation of refeeds. Right. However, something that Abel, give another shout out to him now, is he said, was it that he incorporated refeeds, or was it just that he wasn't crash dieting like he had done in the past? And that's, I think, a valid point.
Absolutely.
I think refeeds, I personally am in favor of them from everything I've seen. But I don't think it's a difference of 10 pounds of stage weight. I think it may be, maybe a couple. But it is interesting, and I've heard other people say that that's why they don't like to incorporate them. Like you said, they kind of go off the rails. Yeah. I can kind of see that too, because when you're in that mindset, you're just like, I'm dieting and like, this is just how I am. And it's a personality thing a lot of times.
Absolutely. Yes.
Some people are just prone to binging. I would even say I'm not immune to that. Sometimes I'm like, man, like, I don't even like a 3,000 calorie feed. Like, what's the point? I either want 6,000 plus.
I'm listening.
Yeah, go for it. I can wait.
Right. I would say, for a lot of people, eating at maintenance is harder than going for broke.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because and even with the full diet, like this is a question that's kind of tangential, but kind of not, that comes up quite a bit. Is it, some people will be like, is it just me, or is it harder to control my food intake at maintenance than when I'm dieting? Yeah. And the answer is, no, it's not just you. This is common for a lot. It's common for me. It's common for you, because maintenance is so nebulous.
Yeah.
It's like my mentor actually once said, I don't agree with this entirely. Said, if you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards. Well, I don't agree with that completely, but I see what he's getting at, right? When you're dieting, you're dieting. I have a explicit goal that I am trying to achieve. I flipped the diet switch. And it is a mental switch.
Self-control has a purpose behind it.
Right. All of a sudden, yes, my suffering has a very specific goal. If you are bulking, you flip it in the other direction. Now I'm going to eat even if I'm not hungry.
Yeah.
Which people will think, God, does that really happen? Yes, eventually it does. Eventually you just get fed up with having to eat. But in the middle, it's just this weird, like, well, I'm not dieting and I'm not trying to gain. So the hell am I? And hunger still tends to be a little bit there if you're dieted down. So you're a little bit hungry, but you don't really have that specific goal. Now, you could, of course, set a goal of I want to maintain, but it's still pretty nebulous.
Yeah.
And it can be a lot harder for some people to do. And I think the same thing, like you said, it's like, okay, so you're dieting, you're on 2,000 calories. Well, your estimated maintenance is 2,600. So hooray, your refeed day, you get to eat 600 whole more calories.
Mm-hmm.
Why even bother, right? Like, why even screw that? Let me do a UD2 style refeed where I can go double maintenance and eat 5,500 calories and make half of that Captain Crunch.
Right.
Because then I'll be easy to go back onto my diet because
that's my go-to.
Because the roof of my mouth will be torn to shreds. I won't be able to eat because it hurts. You know what? It's worth it. It's like eating pizza that's too hot. Yep. You know it's going to hurt, and it's worth every bite. Captain Crunch is worth every bite. But yeah, so there is for some people, and when you're talking about the extremes, when you're talking about physique dieters, you have to people listening need to keep in mind, you have a day that you have to be in shape by, right? It's not like general dieting. And like, yes, we set our goals, whatever it is, spring break, summer, I want to be done by this point. But in the big picture, for the general dieter more so, there's no finish line in the sense of I don't have to be in unless you have a specific event. Right. A physique dieter and competitive athletes to a lesser degree, right? If your competition season starts on X day and you need to be competition ready, that's when you have to be in shape.
Yeah.
Simi's saying, training for powerlifting, we know exactly what day she needs to be at her goal weight, right? And she's lucky that she doesn't see big water swings or anything like that. But now we've got her water cutting down to an absolute science. But with a physique dieter, if you know, okay, I have to be in shape. My contest is on Saturday, June, whatever. They're really, unless you start early enough to give yourself some flex time, you have to stay on schedule. And if you're ahead of schedule, it's always a little bit easier to slow things down.
Right.
If you get behind schedule, you can be in deep trouble, right? Now, I know some people, and this is, I know if I were prepping someone again and they got behind, I would make them suffer for a week with rapid fat loss to get them back on schedule. That's, I think Eric Helms has said that works real well for men and really badly for women. And which doesn't surprise me based on what we know, like metabolically is differences. But so if you are someone and you know that, okay, a refeed, that day of benefit that I gain is going to cost me 2 days of trying to get my head back in the game, that may not be worth it to you. Again, unless you just plan it, plan for your screw up. I hate to say screw up, but you plan for it ahead. Right. Like, okay, I'm going to give myself an extra week of dieting to take. And like I said, people got in shape without this forever. I think for most it's beneficial, but it's never been mandatory.
Do you think it's worse for women for reasons other than that they tend to hold more water, like even after that week is over, it would still be worse for them?
You mean in terms of doing like
a rapid fat loss for the week?
Yeah, I think it's more just like women's bodies can really, I hate to say use metabolic shutdown, but their systems adapt much more quickly and much more severely than men to what's called low energy availability, basically how many calories is left over after exercise. Right. And I think they can put themselves in the hole a lot deeper and faster than men can. And I think that's really the difference that's going. And once they're down there, well, you come right back to still a dieting situation. Yeah. And I think they can almost be in a worse place. They're kind of out of luck no matter what. If you're behind, you're behind. And you either have to pick a different competition or do what you have to do to get back on schedule. But it seems like that was at least Eric's experience, that women respond. And I think it's just that their bodies adapt so hard to those very low calories that they don't get a chance to. Now, I guess you could follow with a week at maintenance. Right. But at that point, it's probably a wash.
Yeah. What do you think is some of the most, because obviously we talk about averages here, and I think a lot of the times, the majority of the time, people aren't going to have this true, like you said, metabolic damage. The calories are still the calories, right? And you can put yourself in a deficit. But I think there's certainly a wide range of adaptations, right? For one, the actual metabolism slowing. Two, obviously decreases in need can be dramatic. what are maybe, I don't know if you have like an anecdote or just what you've seen in general of people, like some of the more extreme examples of adaptations. If I look at myself, I'm sure there are people who, adapt even more than I do, but I would say I can maintain 190, 195 on 3,500 calories a day.
Right.
But I will drop down to like 2,200 calories relative. Now, that 2,200 calories is often with moderate refeeds once a week. So,
Sure.
obviously you have to factor that in. But I'm just saying it seems to adapt pretty quickly to the point where I'm like, damn, man, I've been dieting for like 1 to 2 months and I'm already starting to like suffer quite a bit.
Yeah.
So maybe if you have any examples of like extremes that you've seen.
Well, even like, well, I don't know if I could put numbers to it, but even in the research, you will see like a fivefold difference in what's called the adaptive component of metabolic rate drop. Right, like most of what happens, the decrease in energy expenditure is just because you're smaller. Right, smaller body has lower, but burns less calories at rest, burns less calorie at activity. You can see decreases in activity and stuff like that. But there's this adaptive component, which is the
Right.
drop. It's in excess of what you would predict, and it varies enormously. Like and actually the paper I was reading that I read the title of that talked about this FGF21 was looking at that. And I've talked about this before. What they will do is they will take a group of people, and first they will overfeed them.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll go, okay, in response to overfeeding, and it's always awesome. It's like they gave them 1,000 extra calories. They forced them to eat 1,000 calories extra per day for.
Right.
I'm like, sign me up? Like, how do I want to get fat for science? And they'll measure that, and then they'll fast them, and then they'll measure the drop. And what you see is the people who get the biggest increase to overfeeding get the smallest drop to dieting. They're what's called the quote unquote spendthrift metabolism. It's harder for them to gain weight and it's easier for them to lose it. These are the genetically lucky. And then there's the other half. They get the smallest increase to overfeeding and the biggest drop with fasting. And they are the thrifty metabolism, the thrifty phenotype. It's very easy for them to gain weight and very hard for them to lose it. And like I said, so in response to dieting, a 500 calorie per day deficit, one person might have a 1,500 calorie per day drop and someone else might get 400.
Yeah.
And that alone, right, people make this big deal about, oh, why isn't the real world fat loss the same as predicted? And this is a big part of why, right? If you create a 500 calorie per day deficit and within a week, your body has lowered your energy expenditure by 400 calories, suddenly that pound a week prediction has become less than a pound a month. Because now your deficit is 100 calories per day.
Right.
There was actually, I've seen this reported twice. This one, probably George Bray, who's been doing this for 100 years. And they've measured 1 million people coming through their lab on diet. And they found 2 women, I think exactly 2, that in response to a 500 calorie per day deficit, their bodies lowered daily energy expenditure by 500 calories and put them right back into balance almost immediately. Wow. Now, that's the very, very, very extreme.
Yeah.
For most people, it's somewhere between these two. And even in the Minnesota study, and I'd have to go look to find the numbers, like they talk about, the average drop in energy expenditure was like 25%, but there was still a huge range.
Yeah.
And I think this also partly goes to some of the difference, like successful physique athletes. Okay, successful athletes, by definition, are the ones that, like, yes, they all work hard. I get it. They all train harder than any 10 men. Don't mishear me. But they wouldn't reach the top without inherent physiological advantages. It's true of any sport. That sport selects for the best, which means not only the ability to suffer and work, but also the genetics, period. It's both. I actually just did an article series on my website. It's called Can Hard Work Beat Talent? And I blather about this for 4 parts.
When was that put up?
Well, I mean, I wrote this like a decade ago, but I've been going through and fixing a bunch of stuff on my website. So I just went through and basically did a lot of re-editing and reorganizing of it. It's called Can Hard Work Beat Talent? And the answer is generally no, but sometimes.
Right.
At the highest level, no. The highest level guys have the talent, genetics, and they work hard. The lowest level guys have no talent and don't work hard. And then in the middle, if you've got someone who's talented, who's lazy, someone who's willing to just suffer might pull out a rocky moments, but they're still never going to beat the best.
Right.
Period.
Yep.
And I have a feeling that if you looked at it, you would find that the people that are getting lean easily, and don't get me wrong, contest dieting is never easy. Sure. It is 6 months of suffering to get to the bottom limits of and struggling against your body, screaming at you to eat. But I have a feeling that they are not seeing, the ones who are not needing refeeds or not using them are probably the ones that just aren't seeing the big drops, right? Like I used to talk to physique folks back in the day, and a lot of them wouldn't even like diet by the numbers. And this was an experience thing. They're just like, yeah, start my diet about here every couple weeks, cut my serving of starch in half, bump my cardio by 10 minutes. They're just sort of adjusting it by about 100 calories a week, and they just come straight down. And the rest of us are like, the hell, man, this doesn't work. Because it does when you the common problem has been that the folks that have those advantages don't understand why everyone else is having that many, because it doesn't apply to them. They're like, I've never needed refeeds. You shouldn't either. Well, I'm not you and you're not me. And I'm not saying that, that can be a cop-out, but it's like, yeah, you've probably never experienced any of this. You've never experienced the water retention, the fat loss. You've never seen this happen in you for whatever reason. Maybe it's
that's something I used to say. I've said it actually a few times before that, like, we kind of all hate those people. Like, it's just very frustrating. But at the same time, I think when it becomes understandable is when those people are very conscientious and they've also tried really hard from the start. Because I look at like myself, and I really did, I know it's very easy to say like, oh, these teens, they don't know how to push themselves or whatever, but I will always stick by the fact that like I was killing myself at a young age. And if I had the great results I expected to have, I mean, eventually, yes, I would have been around this sport long enough to see, wow, you're not responding. But the reality is all of my friends didn't push as hard as I did. Like, none of them did. So I would have just assumed you don't look like me because you don't put the effort in. And that would have lasted maybe until now, but at least through like up until college, I would have just assumed I put in the work and you don't. And so you just got to do this, bro. You just got to do this, and so I do understand that mindset. Of course, it's frustrating, but I get where it comes from. If you're just gifted.
Sure. And again, make no mistake, we tend to play this game of it's talent or hard work, and it's not. It's both. Right. And the thing is that if you are naturally talented, like some of the best athletes make the worst coaches because they've never really had to struggle, and they don't know, or frequently they get to the point that they're so good at something that they don't know how to explain it. It's actually called, it's like the amnesia of expertise. You could get guys that can swing a golf club, but if you ask them to describe what they're doing, they don't know. It's so intuitive to them at this point. They can't tell you what they're doing. But regardless, that is sort of the problem since they've never really dealt with it. And it's like, yeah, are there a lot of people that don't put in the work? Sure. Absolutely. There's a lot of people that, go half-assed and skip every other workout and miss meal and whatever it is. Absolutely. But there's also, again, people, you can go into the gym today and see guys that are just working like crazy and getting nowhere. And there's been a lot of recent research on muscle growth starting to identify that there are factually hyper responders.
Right.
And it's been, the way they've studied is really interesting. Is usually what we do is we compare two people, right? So you're in one group and you do whatever 18 sets a week, and I'm in the other group and and we compare our results. And what we think is, we're comparing the number of sets. Well, no. If you got better genetics than I do, we're not comparing the workouts. We're comparing really. So what they do is they take the same person and have them do 18 sets with one arm and 9 sets with the other and see what the response is. And what they're finding is that, let's see if I can describe this correctly, that the difference within a given individual, let me rephrase that. The difference between any two individuals is like
times more.
It was something stupid. I think I saw it was like 10 and one it was like 40 times the difference in any one. So basically, if you are a hyper responder and you grow well to 18, you grow well to 9. And if you're not, you don't grow well to either. And the difference between you and I, assuming you've got the better genetics, is this. And there's between your one arm and your other arm is like this.
I think that's definitely, I'm sure that is true. I mean, we can just see that. Did they do anything in the study to kind of try to make up for the crossover effect that you'd see between arms?
I haven't. It's been a while since I've read them, and the crossover effect would really only be strength. I've never seen anything to show that relates to hypertrophy because it's a neurological thing.
Right.
And since these are trained people, you wouldn't really expect a big issue from that. For people who don't know what we're talking about, the crossover effect refers to this really weird phenomenon. If you just train your right arm or your right leg, your left arm and leg will get stronger. They use this in like rehab and therapy stuff sometimes, but it's more just neurological based. It's not muscle growth. That doesn't work. And since it was trained folks, I don't think it would be that big of a deal. And they're starting to identify what the characteristics are of hyperresponders. Better mitochondrial function is one. The ability to synthesize ribosomes is another. Right. There's been a couple of others, and I forget.
Androgen receptor density.
Yeah, stuff like that. Like, and I mean, we've observed this. You can take two people and put them on the same training, working, and one will blow up, and the other one will get nowhere with it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot, so that this is all starting to become an issue. But again, what happens in like when you look at dieting and training and stuff, like you said, generally the people that we think we should listen to are the ones that are the best. And in a way, they may be the last person you want to listen to. You know, I remember years ago reading something in Peak Training Journal and talking about some horrible seminar. And there's a guy that had a great back who came in and said, "Yes, how about like if you've already got a great body part, nobody cares what you did to build it because you could have done anything. Like find a guy who had terrible calves and built big calves. That's the guy you want to listen to."
Doesn't happen. I'm convinced it doesn't happen.
Generally, it does if you do what I wrote about in my article, Training the Calves, and what we can learn from kangaroos. But that's a whole different thing. Still one of my
I'm still sporting the same 15-inch calves I had in high school, despite torturing them for 10 years. So I'm convinced calves are 90% genetic.
I can tell you how to do it. I did a Q&A thing for some newsletter once. And they got a bunch of experts. Be like, tell us what the best way to train the calves is. And I was like, physiology, anatomy, and the number 3 was get real fat. I go, man, you want to see people that have some big calves just gain a ton of weight because just having it just progressive overload. And I don't think that's the answer they were really expecting. And I was half joking, but half not joking.
Well, we don't have to get too much into that, but I will say, just as a small story, I remember, I really, when I say like a decade of torturing my calves, I mean, everything you could think of, super high reps, super low reps, super high frequency, low frequency. I've read your article on it. I've done everything you could imagine. And, at one point my arms were like 13 inches and my calves were like 15.
Yeah.
And at my biggest, my arms were 17 inches. Calves still 15. And I was on I was on a forum group one time, and this guy he would always say I was like so negative. I actually got kicked out of the group, but it was like there was this guy with these huge, just obviously naturally gifted calves, and I was saying how like, dude, like, you're not saying anything special here. You're telling pause at the bottom, like basic stuff. And I said, genetics are such a big factor. You've always had huge calves. And then the moderator, I guess, was like saying how like, look at his calves. He knows what he's talking about. And I was like, dude. And like, I knew what the moderator looked like. And I was like, you have super skinny calves. How are you going to tell me? So I made a whole video on it. But anyway.
Calves have always just been considered the most genetic body part. Like for decades, that's just been. Dan Duchesne, he was another guy back in the day. Like same thing. He's like, trained him high reps, trained him low reps. He's like, I trained him 3 times a day. He's like, I'd get up in the middle of the night and do calf raises. He's like, I kept a seated calf raise machine next to my bed and get up in the middle of the night and train him. He's like, nothing. And that's pretty much the case. But so we sort of got off.
Every muscle group was like that, though. Jeez, like if it was just like, one or the other.
But yeah, so this we kind of got off track talking about that individual variability in metabolic rate adaptation, and it's definitely there, and it seems to be like it can be like 5-fold difference in response to the same so I some people just objectively have it harder than others. In this paper that I was looking at was kind of looking at trying to determine what the mechanisms are, and it's like they looked at leptin and ghrelin, and a lot of what they do is like I said overfeeding. Another one I saw was cold exposure versus fasting, because cold should get a big hormonal response that causes you to burn more calories, and fasting and same thing, the people that get the biggest response to cold get the least response, the smallest drop to fasting, and vice versa. So there is an inherent physiology here.
Sorry, did you say the people who get the smallest, can you say that again, to the fasting
So,
versus
so
cold?
if you put someone in the cold, the people whose metabolic rate goes up the most in response to shivering will drop the least during fasting. So it's that same spendthrift metabolism. They jack up metabolic rate in response to metabolic stress. They
Mm,
don't drop it as hard in response to dieting, and vice versa. Folks that don't have their metabolism go up in response to cold
mm,
get a bigger drop during fasting. So it's
gotcha.
it's all part of this, and they're still trying to figure out like what the reasoning is. And this FGF21 seem to be, they're calling them hepatokines. It's just chemicals released from the liver.
Hmm.
Uh, seem to be one of them. And one of the really weird ways that they study this is they use low protein overfeeding. For some reason, I forget what the details are, this is a way to really establish like differences in physiology and propensity to weight gain. And I don't remember the specific details of why that is. And so yeah, they're like, okay, so we did carbohydrate overfeeding and we did low protein overfeeding, and there were these enormous differences in response of this. And ghrelin, and there's other things related to all of this, that it's like some people just have a biology that it's mainly due to overfeeding and dieting. Like it's not
Yeah.
necessarily low metabolic rate, since that tends to be less common. Couple studies, oddly enough, have shown that a higher metabolic rate actually is the bigger risk for weight gain than lower, which
Really?
makes no, well, the premise being that when you increase metabolic rate, or a higher metabolic rate may drive appetite. So if the high metabolic rate causes you to eat out of proportion to the increase, that can cause you to gain weight rather than the other way around.
So I don't think I told you this before. I've mentioned it on the podcast though, but I had a few month period where I was prescribed thyroid hormone, and I've said I think it was definitely premature. I look back and I'm kind of surprised that the doctor even prescribed it.
Yeah.
But I might have actually mentioned this to you, but it was the first time where I could really relate to a lack of control because
I,
I had never cheated, like literally like 12 years, never cheated on my diet. I had like cheat days, but like an unplanned cheat didn't happen.
sure.
And
Yes.
the combination of just this ravenous hunger combined with, I think, psychologically knowing that, like, oh, I can just, take thyroid hormone and it'll
Sure.
undo it.
Yes.
Numerous nights, I would just like pig out on like Rice Krispie treats and Pop Tarts and shit. And it was like, I mean, that
Awesome.
I had never, yeah, but I had never done that before. And it
Yeah.
was the worst relationship I've had with food. And it just made me feel like, man, like imagine if it was like this all the time. Like I
Yeah.
haven't taken it in years. It was literally just a couple months, and I'm back to normal. And so I think it was prematurely prescribed. But in any
Sure.
case, it was like an eye-opening experience. I was like, I am so hungry,
Right.
and so I can see, why that theory could potentially make
Yeah.
sense.
And it's just, some studies do, and like others will be like, okay, this seems to be predictive of weight gain down the road. And like what you have to do is measure a bunch of people and then see what happens years later. And the problem, of course, is that weight gain it's behavioral, it's environmental, it's physiological. There's a lot going on here, which is, it's great and ecologically valid in the sense that it represents the real world, but who knows what's going on, right? We're great. We're the only creature that can like consciously choose not to eat when we're hungry,
Right.
and want to eat when we're not hungry. Whereas, you look at, that's why I study animals a lot. It's like, animals might as well just be a gut and a nervous system
Right.
and humans are not. So that's why, so then they do these controlled short-term studies, and they're like, okay, well, we did overfeeding and caused this and this and this, and one group got this response and it was mirrored by this response, and the other group got this one, and like there's a behavioral one. They looked at brown adipose tissue, and that, A, it's minuscule in amount, B, it's very rarely, if ever, activated in the modern world anyway, and C, I don't think they found that it really had much predictive value. It does in animals, but again, in humans, it's just doing different things. So yeah, there's all this under the hood stuff that they still haven't quite figured out.
Those adaptations that you mentioned, though, so all of that was physiological then, right? You haven't even mentioned neat differences, right?
Sure, and that's another big one. And this is, I looked into research on this for the women's book, right? So NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, all that extra activity that we do. And that was really one of the first, I think, profound papers, that one by Levine that started this whole trend of cutesy paper names, which was non-exercise activity thermogenesis, a neat explanation for resistance. And it's like, har, har, har.
Yeah.
And it's just been downhill from there. Anyway, what he did was he took a bunch of people, put them in a metabolic chamber, no activity, and overfed them like 1,000 calories a day for like 8 weeks or something. Again, sign me up.
Right.
Sign me up for this. Sign me up for the sleep studies. I'm totally down. Wire me up, take my blood, just let me play PlayStation and sleep 18 hours a day.
Right.
And pay me to do it. So down. Anyway, and they found at the end of the 8 weeks, the differences in fat gain was like eightfold or 10. It was huge. Like some people gained an absolute metric ton of body weight fat. The other groups didn't. And again, people have used this to go, see, it's not just calories in, calories out. Like, see, this is why you don't understand what you're talking about. The difference was calories out changed.
Right.
And some people burned off like at the high end, like 800 calories a day with NEAT. And at the time, it was mainly fidgeting, changing body posture, going from standing up to sitting down, right? The example I use, we all knew that dude in high school, right? Who's always just like, his leg was just bouncing 8 hours a day, and he was super skinny. And when you do the math on it, you're burning like 300 or 400 calories a day with that stuff, right? It's really ridiculous how it adds up. But then the people that gained the most fat, their NEAT barely went up. And from memory, one subject had NEAT go down. And of course, it was a woman, because the women all got the worst response. Because of course they did. Because women's bodies hate them even more than men's bodies hate us. But NEAT does go down when you diet, which is another place, right? Like, so we say maintenance is 2,500 at maintenance. Or like you said, you maintain at 3,400.
Yeah.
Well, basic calorie math says, well, to lose a pound of fat, 2,700. Right. And you've done it. And it didn't work. Because as soon as you reduce calories, the thermic effect of food comes down a little bit. 50 calories, 100 calories a day. It's not much, but it changes the equation.
Right.
Generally, many of us are just less active. NEAT goes down unless you very consciously stay aware of it. And that's why, and people have done this right now that we have all these super duper cool step trackers. And I used the Body Bug back in 2008. That was like the first one of these things, armband you wore. And you can watch the numbers change. And that's another change with, I think, modern dieting. You look at physique, they're lifting, they're doing cardio, and they've got this seeming big deficit, and they go at home, they just lay down all day because they're exhausted. Because the body is going, knock this off. We don't want you to starve to death. But now that they've got the trackers, they can see those numbers changing, and the goal then becomes try to at least maintain your pre-diet NEAT levels. Because if that, so again, you do a 500 calorie deficit, if you're an unlucky one and your NEAT drops by 300, well, your deficit just got cut to 200 calories a day. Right. Pound a week has now become less than a pound every 2 weeks, about 1.5 pounds per month, just from that one change. And but again, highly variable. I looked at like 3 or 4 different studies in the women's book, and they like measured a ton of people with different diets at different centers, and the drop was anywhere from like 100 calories a day, and like I think there were a few 300 calories. Like, it's hugely variable.